Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey. Hey.
Today we are wrapping up our series on postmodern novels of the South, where we discussed John Kennedy Toole's Confederacy of Dunces, Karen Russell's Swamplandia, and Walker Percy's The Moviegoer. As a reminder, you can join our extended book discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod, and find us on social media at Canonical Pod, all one word. If you would like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which you can find in our episode description. And on bookshop.org, you can find our recommended books, including our reading list for our book club. So this episode, we'll be talking spoilers. If you don't want the ending of these books spoiled for you, check out our previous review episodes. Next week, we will review the first book in our new Posthumanist series, Galapagos, by Kurt Vonnegut, which I'm really enjoying, by the way. Before we get started with that, let's take a second look at Southern literature. We're very fortunate to have author and publisher Jon Sealy from Haywire Books back on the podcast today to tell us a bit more about why Southern literature, as we know it, may not really exist anymore. We all kind of know what you mean, John, when you say, this kind of Southern literature is gone. But what exactly do you mean? Like, how would you bookend that time period that you're talking about?
Well, I would say the construct started with the fugitive poets. So Robert Penn Warren and John Crow Ransom and a few other folks in the 1920s created this sort of new South intelligentsia. They were, the way I understand it, were kind of trying to combat some of the, more New England-based intellectual hubs and try to create an intellectual hub of the South, of literature from the South, for the South, etc. I don't think you can really divorce that from race. So it was always kind of a white person's genre, right? So they were living in the shadow of the Civil War and Reconstruction. They had this sort of lost cause that they were sort of reckoning with. And so there was kind of a mode of literature, includes Faulkner and O'Connor and Percy and Welty and, on to sort of some of the rough South characters of the 90s and 2000s. So Larry Brown is kind of one of the greats, if you would. He came out of Mississippi in the 80s. Published in the 80s and 90s and died in 2004. And that's kind of why I would say that is kind of a bookend, because his publisher was Algonquin Press, which was out of Chapel Hill. And they, under the editor Shannon Ravenel, were very much a Southern-focused press. They had this anthology of stories called New Stories from the South that had been running since about 1980 through 2010. And each volume had a preface from somebody, and you can almost trace the ending of the South through those final prefaces. So I can't remember what year off the top of my head, but Rick Bass, the Southern author, had kind of wrote a preface in the early 2000s where he was talking about the South as a capitalized thing, and Southerners love stories, and he was kind of reveling in the notion of Southernness. And then around 2008, ZZ Packer came in and edited it, or wrote the preface. I'm not sure if she edited it, but she wrote the preface and, made a clear distinction between capital Southern versus lowercase Southern, meaning Southern by region versus Southern as a thing. And then the final volume was edited or, had a preface from Amy Hempel, who is not a Southerner, and comments in her preference like, why is somebody from Chicago or wherever being asked to write about Southern literature? And I think what you kind of have seen in that anthology, which I think is what you've seen in Southern literature across the board for the last 30 or 40 years, and what you've seen across the South, is kind of an expanding openness. So it's no longer the old white guy canon, but started including, a multitude of voices. And I think the nature of life in the South, as it has become more open and progressive, has no longer clung to that sort of old identity, to where, like in Robert Penn Warren's day, a white guy in the South in Richmond, Virginia, could have a cultural connection to a white guy in Jackson, Mississippi, because they were part of the old Confederacy and grappling with some of the same psychological baggage. But now I live in Richmond, and I feel like no connection to somebody in Jackson, Mississippi. I feel like Baltimore, D.C. is right up the road. The nature of regionalism has changed because it doesn't have that cultural connection or cultural definition. how I would frame it is this sort of idea of a construct was related and inextricable from, the Confederacy, and that sort of old history has changed so that now our cultural connections are, really more tribal and online. So most of my closest friends, or a lot of my close friends, live elsewhere. They don't live in Virginia or the South, and I connect with them over the phone, over social media, over email. The nature of our culture has changed as it has, become more expansive. And I think a good example of what I'm talking about is Colson Whitehead's novel, The Underground Railroad, which is technically a Southern novel. It's set in the South and grappling with issues in the South. Well, it's, I guess, largely set in the South, but it was not hailed as like this grand new Southern novel, right? Because it's not. It's an American novel. There's a sort of a parallel canon of African American literature that it's kind of adding to, but it doesn't fit in the old John Crow Ransom, Robert Penn Warren mode. And so that's I guess what I mean is that the idea of Southern literature as this holistic thing is no longer a thing because the nature of our culture has progressed.
Thanks for stopping by again, John. You're a busy person, I'm sure, so we'll let you go. If you want to hear more from author and publisher Jon Sealy, you can listen to our previous episode where we had an in-depth discussion with John about Walker Percy's The Moviegoer. You can find more information about John's work by going to jonsealy.com or by clicking the link in our episode description below. Now let's return to the topic at hand. Sam, what did you think?
One of the things I found interesting in these books is how the protagonists are all white, as are the authors, but at some point all are compared in some way to people of another race. Black people in the cases of The Moviegoer and A Confederacy of Dunces, and Native Americans in Swamplandia. So, for example, Binks observes how Mercer is stuck in his role, serving the Bowlings, and thus never self-actualized. But this in turn is a mirror showing how Binks, too, is not finding his own path successfully. In A Confederacy of Dunces, Ignatius tries to be an agitator and fails at every level, while Jones succeeds slyly and cautiously and ends up saving Ignatius's life in the process at the end. The big trees in Swamplandia, as we discussed, are faking a native inheritance. Southern literature, as a genre, has race issues as its roots, positioning itself against the North and its anti-slavery ideals in the early 1800s. But I'm wondering what these books show about progress, or if they show progress. They all still seem to portray non-whites as an other. I don't know that I'd call Confederacy of Dunces progressive, and yet it might be the most progressive among these three just based on how Jones isn't that much of an other in the book.
We talked a bit about this with Swamplandia, and in my mind, that book actually is quite different from the other two in how it approaches race. Recalling our discussion, I think in our Swamplandia episode, we talked about whether or not it could be excused that the big trees assume this native identity, because the big trees assume a native identity, but they're not doing this in a harmful way or maliciously. It's kind of satirizing the people who do this, because the big trees seem absurd and comical. I don't know if that really excuses the behavior, but in a way it is approaching this topic directly. It's talking about people who claim heritage, whereas in the other two books, the non-white characters are present in the book, but they're not that major of a plot point. They're certainly more present in A Confederacy of Dunces, because like you said, Jones is a key character. But in The Moviegoer, I think they're very much in the background and not featured. In some ways, that's more harmful, but it's also perhaps a product of its times, being that it was written in a much more segregated time. I don't know if we can expect Percy to be more enlightened and to include these characters just because another writer of that time was including these characters in a more meaningful way.
Right. I agree about Swamplandia too, but those characters are also in the background. And even though it is satire, we also discussed last time how the mere fact that they are portrayed, even fictionally, as this other is part of the problem. And I'm wondering if that is a step backward, even though I agree that I don't think it's harmful, and it is satirizing these kinds of fakes, but the fact is that the truth isn't really there. We do have some characters, talking down to Sam Bigtree, the chief, but that's really the only character, and he's not even really a character. He doesn't get any lines. He's just seen from afar.
It feels murky, especially because we think, right, that Russell is not of Native heritage. It just feels more acceptable if she is. And I don't think she is.
I have to say here, it's not murky at all for me. It's pretty crystal clear to me. I mean, yes, she's not Native. Yes, the characters are not Native. And yes, they are pretending to be Native. But the character's position to the world and our position as readers accessing the world of the novel are such that we don't take it as a representation of our reality, and we don't take them as symbols of justice or symbols of the good. It's a very personal experience, a very enchanted experience that we have with this world, and I don't think that we do the novel justice if we worry too much about this sort of thing.
I think the murkiness for me stems from the fact that there's this big struggle among Native Americans, their right to exist, or how they're portrayed in media as a group of people who have vanished. So she's playing into that trope. I think that's what's murky. If you are yourself Native, then you can say, well, I'm here and I'm writing about this. But if she's not Native, then she's someone who's not Native, once again, perpetuating that stereotype of Natives not being actually here in our world. For me, that's the issue.
I suppose it depends on how patently ridiculous you find the Bigtree family. For me, in my reading, their whole kind of setup of being a Native family living in the Everglades, it was full of camp humor. It was obviously not accurate. It was obviously not real life. So in that sense, their existence as quote unquote Native people doesn't cover up the actual existence of real Native people. It just kind of amplifies how ridiculous they are and how ridiculous that kind of roadside Americana can be.
Yeah, I agree. I think, though, the problem is still, whether or not this Native American heritage is used as a prop. It could have been something else, maybe.
Well, that's the thing. It absolutely was used as a prop, but that's kind of the point. I think what Russell is trying to point to here is that for some people and at some times that was done. And I think that it's a risk, I admit, because she is doing something that other people might disagree with. Anytime you talk about assuming another race, it's a risk. But I think that it's faithful to the spirit of the theme that she wanted to invoke. If she wanted to talk about roadside Americana and tacky kind of tourist attractions, and she didn't engage with this, it wouldn't have had the impact that it does.
So it's hard to plot a graph from 3 points, but is this progress? Is this a graph going upward and continuing upward?
I mean, if we have 3 points, yeah, but as far as I can tell, Confederacy of Dunces and the Moviegoer are roughly contemporary with each other, so I don't see much difference between those two. I do see a difference between Swamplandia and the other two, but I hate to be the odd man out, but I'm not too bothered about the other two either.
I'm not too bothered. I'm just trying to figure out, since this is a genre that is based on a location that is based on its approaches to race, largely anyway. I'm trying to see what that graph might tell us about that genre.
Well, as I mentioned in the episode that we were talking about the moviegoer, Percy said that in that novel, he really wanted to get at the interiority of Binks as a character and to not represent the world in any sort of a faithful way or any sort of an objective way, but to represent the world as it would appear to the individual. So I think that would account for the way women in the novel appear. And it also accounts for the way that Mercer appears. Yes, he's on the periphery. Yes, he doesn't have much of a role, but in terms of the way that Binks sees the world at that point in time, it seems accurate to his worldview.
I see that. That makes sense. The fact that it's a philosophical novel kind of makes that a little harder to swallow, even though it still goes with the logic that philosophy that he's showing us is the change that happens internally in him. But race seems to exist outside of that philosophy. So we're forced to grapple with that and figure out how does his seeing Mercer and then the black man at the end on Ash Wednesday as these others that are like him and different from him, how does that fit into this Kierkegaardian set of tropes?
You can say it's an epiphanic ending, right? He has this big realization and he changes his way of living. But I don't think it's fair to say when you have one epiphany that your entire worldview has changed. He does change. There is some growth on his part, but it doesn't mean that everything in him changes. And I don't think that we need to redeem every aspect or every failing that he had at the beginning of the novel to make the novel interesting and worth reading.
I mentioned this in that episode. I think the ending for me is very obviously racial in nature, but I don't think it's problematic. So the way I see it as racial in nature is he shows an image of a black man driving up in a car, and I think he's described as a well-dressed black man. And to my mind, when I understand this perhaps from Percy's or Binks's point of view, is that this is a sign of progress, that relatively successful black man can drive up in a car. I think we are supposed to read that and take it as this is progress for black people. And I think that kind of statement is, of course, inherently racial, because he's comparing it to a history of black people not being able to do that. But I don't think it's offensive, if that makes sense. There's nothing inherently wrong with that image, but it's playing on historical factors that may cause you to feel unease.
The fact that he looks at that guy as a curiosity, and the fact that he's black and not anything else, specifically white, the fact that he's curious about it makes me suspicious of Binks. But as he had said, just because he's had one epiphany doesn't mean he's enlightened. It fits with the character. It's okay.
Well, I kind of feel like the two of you are talking about different things in a way. Like, you're looking at it purely from the text and also from the writer himself saying, well, I'm writing from this character's point of view, so it can be excused. Whereas Sam, you're looking at it from the point of view of cultural criticism, where it doesn't matter what the author's intention is. The mere fact that he's a white person writing about a black person is significant, or the lack of black people in any meaningful way is significant. I think both points are valid.
I am divorcing Percy's view from Binks's. I get that those are two different things, and that's fine. But yeah, I think those two things are at odds with each other, and it's fine for them to be at odds with each other, but I think it's worth discussing anyway.
I think in cultural criticism, you certainly can look at books in depth, but it very much is looking at patterns. Like the Moviegoer, let's say if you look at that as one book among like 10 books where white writers from the South sideline black characters and don't meaningfully talk about black characters in their experience. I mean, that's something that people do all the time. Like they talk about, publish all the time. And then if you look at just a book and unpack its meaning, and you don't talk about the racial aspect. That's something that literature people do all the time too. So for me, it's like two different conversations.
I do think that there is a way to kind of have them meet in the middle, but it would require more context than we have right now. When I say that Percy didn't intend for the novel to show the world beyond Binks's perspective, I don't mean that that excludes or apologizes or kind of excuses the impact that the novel might have on other readers by excluding Black experiences from fiction. But while it doesn't excuse it, it does explain what I think Percy had in mind and why that particular experience wasn't part of the novel.
I mean, it's like, if you look at it once again from point of view of a critic, it doesn't matter what he thinks.
Let's take it from a broader perspective. We're kind of saying that we could criticize Percy for excluding Black experiences or any meaningful depiction of Black experiences from the moviegoer. But why would we do that? Because there are so many social experiences where lots of othered experiences are not represented meaningfully. The novelist needs to be able to choose something specific and focus on it. And sometimes that specificity excludes certain things, not because the novelist thinks that those things are less valuable or less important, but just because when you have a focus, you include some things and you exclude other things.
On these issues, a lot of times I end up agreeing with Ed. I think that it's not incumbent on writers to approach everything. I don't really know what to do with a lot of these cultural critics, who write for Vanity Fair or whatever. And I'm not dismissing them, but I don't know what one does with this kind of commentary when you say there needs to be more representation in X.
Oh, sure. I'm not even advocating for that. I'm just throwing a hand grenade into the room and seeing what happens. But mostly I want to see, can we see progress from these 3 books? Can we plot that on a graph, or is this not enough for us to say any which way?
All right, we'll take a break here. And when we come back, we'll talk about the philosophical novel and why American novels tend not to be philosophical in nature. Welcome back. I'd like to talk about something different now. This is something that we've talked about at length in our recent books, including the Campus Novels series. Our discussions have centered around the lack of ideas or the lightness of certain novels that we've been reading. So for this series, of course, we read The Moviegoer, a philosophical novel, which is not that light, and Swamplandia and Confederacy of Dunces, 2 novels which are less rigorous in their examination of ideas. Though I think you could argue that Confederacy's use of the consolation of philosophy satirizes the genre of the philosophical novel in an oblique way. So I wanted to look at this relative lightness, or look at why so many of the novels we've been reading are light. I found that the New York Times asked 2 writers in 2015, Pankaj Mishra and Benjamin Moser, to write an essay about why they thought American fiction lacked this kind of ideological heft. So first, Mishra, he cites critic Philip Rav, who argues that philosophical novels are written when a society has to reckon with catastrophic problems, and the US post-World War II did not have to do so, whereas European and Latin American writers did. And Pankaj also states that the creative writing industry cultivates a certain kind of writer who exalt the private experience. Benjamin Moser, on the other hand, agrees with Pankaj that philosophical novels arise during times of societal stress, but he likens these novels to his quote, a shotgun marriage of philosophy and poetry, and believes that they lose importance when the political crisis of the time passes. And he also believes that philosophy and poetry, which for him includes fiction, are fundamentally different, and that fiction explores the complexities of relationships, which is rich in its own right. So, do either of these two or both of these assertions ring true to you?
I think that I agree with Mishra's idea that the philosophical novel often finds its roots in social turmoil and social upheaval. I think it's plausible. There's nothing in the argument that seems false or incorrect to me, but it's just that. It's just plausible. It's one possible explanation among others.
Yeah, I feel that way as well. I also agree with Moser. Well, I don't know if I agree that they lose their importance when the political crisis of the time passes. For example, even though I don't know that the moviegoer is following some specific political crisis, I don't think its importance has lost its luster. I think the importance is whether you're willing to look at it and dig in. So maybe in that way, it has lost its luster a little bit, that we're looking at the philosophy behind it, and we didn't have the Kierkegaardian ideas already. We had to look into that. But I don't know if people of the time also had to do a lot of extra reading in order to get it.
Well, I agree with you on Moser. That line stood out to me too, where he says that once the political problems pass, the book is no longer relevant. And he talks about Ayn Rand as, he cites Ayn Rand as the kind of writer that he's talking about. It seems to me that he's more talking about political writers or political fiction than he is talking about philosophical literature in general. And that might be the cause of that confusion. But for me, I wonder if we can take that sentiment and apply it in a different way. When we read Percy, it's obviously influenced by Kierkegaard, who is moving toward religious discovery, or I guess talks about the process of moving toward religious discovery. Do you think this kind of book, if its time has passed, will still be important? Like, what if most of the reading community is atheist? Do you think then that Percy's book will still have relevance?
I think it will, because I think that the kind of crisis of that novel is the kind of postmodern world that we live in, where our understanding of ourselves and understanding of the world is mediated through representations and through the experiences of others. I think as long as that holds true, the religious aspect of it, while central in Percy's mind, is less important in my mind as a reader, and therefore the novel still has some meaning that will endure.
I agree. And I don't know that Percy would like this, but that's besides the point, as Iad points out, that you can look at that epiphany, you can look at that change in Binks as a metaphorical thing. The search that he's going on and what his decision is in relation to that search at the end, that is still relevant to anyone, religious or atheist or otherwise. Those changes are still things that are worth looking at and questioning in yourself and in the text.
I agree with you both. I think that you can read this as an atheist and still derive meaning from it. I have two caveats, though. The first being that if you are not of a Christian persuasion, I think the ending is much less resonant, just because it's kind of a generic epiphany in that case. It's not a religious epiphany. And if you're religious, then it's more meaningful. But if you're not, then it's any story with an epiphany, essentially. And the other issue here is something we've talked about previously, that Percy does very much stick with the literature side of the philosophical novel. He doesn't venture too far into letting the philosophy dictate what happens in the novel. I think that if he were, that novel would be less relevant to an atheist. If it was much more driven by philosophy and by Kierkegaard, and it was much more about religious rebirth or discovery, I think that then that book would not be as well read or appreciated.
Oh, we did talk about how this isn't that didactic of a book,
Yeah.
and how his other writings are, even though we haven't read his other writings, but it is telling, at least to some degree, that those books, we're not familiar with those books. We did not pick those books. And from what I can tell, they are not as widely read as The Moviegoer still is, even though this was his first book.
Well, I want to cycle back to Mishra's essay, because I think we're in a pretty good position to comment on his comment that the creative writing industry cultivates writers who exalt the private experience, given that we have two products of that industry here on staff. You two have both done MFAs. What do you think about that comment?
I have no opinion because I only talk about myself.
Oh, well done. I agree. It's tough because I don't know any writers who write philosophical novels, which you might say that points to your answer, but also I don't know that it cultivates writers so much as there aren't writers that are trying to cultivate philosophical novels as much. You know, I didn't see anyone try a philosophical story or novel and be shot down for it.
I think that a person who does attempt one might get shot down at the lower levels just because a very didactic novel is so bad that he would get eviscerated in workshop.
Does a philosophical novel have to be didactic?
No, but I think bad writers are. And that's the problem, is if you are a writer in training and at the beginning you're invariably going to be bad and you are attempting something that is philosophical. And I don't want to name names, but I had classmates at Davis who were very much into philosophy and taking creative writing. And their work was bad because they didn't achieve that level of mastery that you need to have to talk about ideas in a meaningful way with it still being fiction, which is also what Moser talks about. Like, you need to marry the two different traditions, and it's very difficult to do it. So in that way, yes, I do think that creative writing kind of exalts the private experience, or at least promotes writers who end up writing in that way.
It seems to me that the creative writing industry in the US, at least, because I don't know what's going on in Europe, but it happened this way because you can teach the craft of fiction and let people mine their own personal experiences for stories to tell. That can be taught, but I don't think that creative writing departments are equipped to teach people to write the philosophical novel, because philosophy is its own body of study, and the professors don't know it well enough or can't be bothered to teach it for the one or two students who are interested in it to equip the students to actually engage with this type of writing. It's kind of like writing a war novel or any other type of, I don't want to say niche fiction, but anything really specific. Like, you just have to come to it from your own personal engagement with the world. And if that's not something that you engage with personally, aside from being a writer, there's no way that a creative writing department could get it into you.
Related to this is an article on Philosophy Now. The article is called The Decline and Rebirth of Philosophy by Daniel Kaufman. And he argues, funnily enough, that philosophers need to get into the fiction writing business, because he says that philosophy is too ensconced in academia and it needs to break out into mainstream culture, popular culture. So this is very much something that a non-creative writer would advocate for, because I think a lot of people in the creative writing industry will not say, oh yeah, you need to be a fiction writer to get your voice out there. I think that this kind of fiction probably comes from philosophers who are trying to write about philosophy in a different way. It doesn't come from fiction writers who are trying to write about fiction in a different way.
In most cases, yes. I mean, if you look at Camus or Sartre, there are philosophers in the sincere sense and fiction writers in the sincere sense. But then you look at somebody like Walker Percy, who is a philosophy aficionado, but not a philosopher himself. So I think that, you know, having an academic background will help you, but you could start as just a fiction writer and approach it with just kind of a studious attitude.
Do you think, going back to these particular books, these books do feel to me like they do have ideas, important ideas, but looking at Swamplandia, for example, I think it would be hard to call that, even though I don't think it's light, it is lighter in the sense we're talking about than the others. And yet, even though it does have plenty of good and important ideas that are worth discussing, it is not a novel of ideas. Is that fair? Would you agree with that about Moser's definition?
Of the three that we read, the only one that I think of as light is Confederacy of Dunces. I think the Moviegoer is definitely not light. Swamplandia is not light, but it's different from the Moviegoer. It's full of thematic meaning and it's full of sensuous prose. The thing that I would say makes Confederacy of Dunces light is not light in the text itself, but light in the experience of reading it. When I finished reading that novel, it just kind of washed away and it didn't stick with me at all. But when I finished Swamplandia, there was something that stuck with me. There was some residue of the reading experience.
So do you think that's more resonance than whether it's light or heavy?
Resonance is not the term that I would use for it because there's nothing that I saw in Swamplandia that reminded me of myself. There was nothing that I saw that was an experience from my life or anything that I know personally. But because the world was so sensuous and so interesting and so active, after I finished reading it, I wanted to know more. It sparked curiosity. My biggest analogy for fiction is I always think of fiction as soil, fertile soil. And good fiction is fertile soil where lots of ideas can grow. And when I read A Confederacy of Dunces, I laughed, but the soil wasn't fertile. There were no ideas that grew in it.
One of the things in Moser's essay that he talks about is that lighter, quote unquote, lighter novels are about relationships between people. Is A Confederacy of Dunces about relationships between people?
I think that's actually one of the issues with it that Yates may be talking about. I'll speak for him here. Because it is not really about a substantial relationship. It's about a lot of very casual relationships, though the relationship between Ignatius and his mother is kind of the central tension in the book. It's not really featured that exclusively and deeply, and also it's not really explored very well. You gradually see the erosion of their relationship, but that's not the point of the novel.
Right. And as we discussed, I think what could lift this up to at least approach a philosophical novel is also what damns it. Its use of Boethius as kind of this weird crutch where it explores it, but not very thoroughly, especially to people who have not read Boethius. It doesn't provide enough of the philosophy for it to be called a philosophical novel.
Yeah, it doesn't do either very much.
Right. It kind of sits in the middle somewhere in this no man's land.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody is claiming that it is. Well, besides James earlier, but I think most critics don't say that it's a philosophical novel, but when I'm saying that I feel it's a bit light, I'm not saying it's light because it should be a philosophical novel. I'm saying it's light because the events of the novel and the description in the novel all seem to be in the novel only as a setup for the next gag. And this is something that we talked about in that episode as well, with the criticism of the editors and the other people who read the novel before publication. It's a very funny novel and there's lots of charming humor, but it has no purpose. It's just setting itself up for the next joke. I think that's something that I don't want in fiction. There is something that happens in fiction that can surprise you when something exists in the novel and you can't immediately see why it exists. And then when it's over, you don't really know why it happened in that particular way. If we go back to Swamplandia, why exactly was the Birdman a Birdman? What does that mean exactly? I don't know, but I know it wasn't the setup for a joke. I couldn't see the strings holding everything together the same way I could see the strings holding everything together when I was reading A Confederacy of Dunces.
So at the end of Mishra's essay, he quotes DeLillo in talking about 9/11, and he says that now America does have to reckon with pretty severe societal issues or systemic issues present in American society. So what do you think about this? Do you think that there is something fundamentally different now, that writers in America will take on more philosophical novels or novels of ideas? We do have one writer here, Russell, who wrote post 9/11, and I don't obviously see it in her work, but speaking generally, I guess we'll be speculating here. Do you think that we might see people turn to philosophy as a way of addressing these issues?
Not really. I mean, I think we would already be seeing that now, and I'm not seeing that. Certainly not as a movement. I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't see it I don't see it as a movement, but I do see people every once in a while pop up and say we need more philosophers in our lives. Oftentimes these are philosophers, so grain of salt.
Right.
But for example, people talk about how we need more philosophers on hospital ethics boards or in local governance, especially in the field of ethics. So I do see that. I think that's something that, I wasn't around, 20 years ago, but I don't know if philosophers are always saying we are still relevant, someone hire us. But I have seen that occur more and more.
Back to your original question, while I understand 9/11 as a good starting place, a good reason we have to have a reckoning and start looking toward that philosophical side. Even though it was a huge moment in time for the US, I don't know that it's enough for us to decide, well, now we have to turn to philosophy.
Yeah, I don't think it's happening either. It might not be because 9/11 was too small of an event to turn America towards philosophy. It might be something that you could call like big country syndrome. Most of Americans are too insular in their own experience of America to really think about their relation to anything beyond this country and beyond their experience. I think that it's not so much our history as our temperament sometimes that we focus on other things, not because history hasn't pushed us outside of ourselves, because we just are of that particular stock of people. I don't know how to explain it. It's an ahistorical sort of temperament. I think when people say that we need more philosophy in the world, some of them might have what I would call like the live, laugh, love sort of philosopher in mind, if you know what I mean, like the kind of pop philosophy idea of what it means to think deeply. I think that that doesn't really need to be in the foreground of our contemporary life, because real philosophy, as I understand it, is much more foundational, and foundational in the sense that when you look at a building to appreciate it, you don't look at the foundation, you look at the roof and you look at the windows. In the same way, when you want to understand the world, the foundation is important, but you don't really look at it unless you know what you're looking for. And most people don't. So I think that it has its place in the margin. It has its place in the ivory tower, and that's kind of where it belongs.
Interestingly enough, these essays were written at the end of 2015. Maybe what we're seeing now is the crisis that forces us to become more philosophical. I could see this big divide that we're seeing in the country currently as much more foundational of an issue, much more divisive and needing of philosophy and novels of ideas to reckon with it than 9/11.
I agree with you we probably do need more philosophy in our lives, and that it forces people to think deeply and think about what is necessary and right. But I wonder if we need this second part of what you said, Sam, which is the novel of ideas. That's what I wonder about. Why does it have to be a novel, right? It can easily be a YouTube video. It can be a movie of ideas. Is the novel of ideas the best way to explore this deeply?
No.
I think it's more lasting, but Yeah, I agree that in today's world, maybe it's not the best way to change minds or change ideas. Maybe we can have some TikTok stars.
Right. It seems to me like TikTok or YouTube, I know you're talking about it as a joke, but I think that if you want to get philosophy out into people's lives and to get people thinking deeply, I mean, I hesitate to say that YouTube will make people think deeply, but I think it does like make people consider or question ideas. A lot of times not in a healthy way, but it does.
But those are also two different things. There's how do you get ideas out, and also how do you make those ideas art? I don't think what we're talking about, TikTok and YouTube, those are not being saved somewhere to be held up on a pedestal as art.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. This is something we've talked about on the subreddit quite a lot. Most recently, Ed and I did, I guess, which is whether or not this is necessary. These kind of novels and these ideas, I mean, is it even necessary? Is it necessary in art? Necessary for preservation? If it can be done in a different media?
If you saw a book like The Moviegoer today, do you think that would gain as much traction to be quote unquote necessary? Do you think it would be worth reading?
Worth reading, yes. I don't know if it would be as popular as it was in the 1960s. I think that fiction in general has a much less important role in our society, and getting people engaged in complicated ideas is more difficult now. I do feel kind of pessimistic about the American attention span, and I do think that to save an idea for the ages, the way that a work of art can, is something that YouTube or TikTok or whatever can't do. But to get people to ingest it now is something that the novel can't do. So unless you have some way to make a hybrid of these two that has the advantages of both, you kind of have to pick one or the other.
Okay, let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. You can find our reading schedule on Reddit at Canonical Pod, where we post threads for our book club discussion every Wednesday. That link is below in the episode description. We'd love for you to join us. You can also find us on social media, again, at Canonical Pod. And if you would like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which is also below in the episode description. Next week, we'll be moving on to our next series, Posthumanist Fiction, and we'll be reading Kurt Vonnegut's Galapagos. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.